No one really looked twice at the old Griggs doll factory on the east side of town. Its windows had been boarded up since the late 90s. The shutters rusted, the walls crawling with vines that clutched the bricks like dead fingers. For years, neighborhood kids would dare each other to get close, then sprint away, shrieking when they swore they saw porcelain faces staring through the cracks. But no one ever went inside until the night a delivery driver called 911. His voice shook. I heard children crying from inside, and laughter. Too many kids laughing, but no one's there. The call landed on Officer Jason Reed's desk. He just clocked out, but he didn't hesitate. 15 years on the force taught him not to ignore a gut feeling. And Ace, his German Shepherd partner, was already waiting by the cruiser door. Tail stiff, ears pricked, whining before they even reached the chain-link gate. Jason broke the rusted padlock. The warehouse breathed mold and time. His flashlight cut through the dust, revealing rows upon rows of dolls stacked on shelves, jammed into cribs and strollers, spilling from boxes. Cracked porcelain faces, painted smiles, dummies with teeth too white. The silence pressed in until even Jason muttered, "Creepy doesn't begin to cover it." Ace moved first, nails clicking on the tile. Then he stopped, dead still. Hackles bristled, a low growl rattling his chest. Jason followed his gaze just a wall, nothing unusual. Except the bricks didn't match, they were newer, sloppy. Jason tapped hollow. Minutes later, an investigative unit arrived. Together, they stripped the bricks away, layer by layer, until a black iron hatch emerged. The smell hit them stale, human, lived in. Jason's flashlight found a narrow tunnel, too small for any adult. Ace lunged forward, eager to crawl inside. Jason yanked him back. Something about this wasn't just wrong, it was designed. That night, they sealed the hatch and marked the scene for forensics. Jason went back to the station, restless. Reviewing his body cam frame by frame, he froze. At the 42-minute mark, passing a row of marionettes, one doll's head turned, slowly. And its eyes, they weren't glass. They blinked. Jason's breath caught. Someone, some child, was inside, disguised, watching. But just as the realization hit, the screen glitched. Static ripped across the footage, and a distorted voice whispered through his headset. "You shouldn't have opened the wall." Jason spun in his chair. The station lights flickered. Down the hallway, Ace barked furiously at nothing Jason could see, and somewhere deep, muffled the sound of children's laughter rose again. This time, it wasn't coming from the factory. It was coming from inside the station.co, conspiracy forums, Reddit threads, even suburban moms on Facebook. It all came back to one thing. The Griggs factory was cursed, or worse. Jason tried to block out the noise. He had work to do. Ace hadn't stopped pacing since they got back. He kept circling the cruiser, pawing at the trunk, whining when Jason tried to distract him. It wasn't normal behavior. Not for Ace. That afternoon, Jason returned to the warehouse alone. The forensics team wasn't scheduled until late evening. He just wanted to double-check something near the wall Ace had barked at. That's when he noticed the doll, not just any doll, a porcelain girl in a white dress propped in a miniature rocking chair. He was sure she hadn't been there yesterday. He moved closer. The doll's face was cracked, its painted smile chipped, but something was wrong with the hands. Jason knelt, reached out, then stopped. The fingers were too flexible. Skin, not porcelain. A faint pulse. Jesus Christ. He yanked the doll forward, and the whole chair tipped over, revealing a narrow shaft behind it. A crawl space. Something shuffled inside. Ace lunged forward, growling. Jason shouted into the shaft, "Police! Is someone in there?" Silence. Then faintly, "Help. Me!" Like true stories, where dogs become heroes. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Heroes for Animals, where real bravery barks louder than words. Jason pulled back, hard pounding. The crawl space was too narrow for him, but Ace could fit. He debated it for a second, then clipped a small flashlight to Ace's collar. "You know what to do? Boy. Go." Ace slipped in like a shadow. Jason waited, crouched, hand on his weapon, listening for anything. For a moment, there was nothing. Then came the bark, sharp, urgent. Jason shouted, "Coming, Ace!" and began prying the edges of the crawl space open. He got just far enough to peek inside. Ace stood in a chamber just big enough for a child to sit. The walls were lined with shelves, but not for tools or storage. They were full of dolls, identical dolls, and in the center, trembling, was a girl. Alive, pale, maybe 7 or 8, she whispered. "Please don't put me back in the box." Jason reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the lights went out. The lights snapped off so fast, it felt like the building had taken a breath and then swallowed them whole. Jason froze, one hand still gripping the radio, the other braced against the edge of the crawl space. Inside, he could just make out Ace's silhouette, motionless and alert, standing guard over the little girl, huddled among the lifeless dolls. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed, code 30 at Griggs' warehouse," he said into the doll. Radio. "I have a child. I repeat, I've located a child alive. Need backup and medics immediately." Lights just went out. Possible tampering with the breaker system. Nothing. Dead air. Jason tried, again, adjusting the dial, his voice low but firm. "Dispatch, confirm." Still, nothing. His skin crawled. The backup generator should have kicked in, at least for emergency lighting. But all he got was pitch blackness and a strange mechanical hum echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. Jason reached for his mag light, flicked it on, and scanned the shadows behind him. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no cacks, just the quiet shudder of a child's breathing from inside the crawl space. He dropped to his knee and spoke softly. "Stay. Don't move." The dog didn't bark, didn't even whine. He just locked eyes with Jason as if waiting for a signal. Jason turned his attention to the girl. "Hey," he said gently. "Can you tell me your name?" She didn't answer. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, and her head was buried under a veil of dark, tangled hair. She wore a frilly white dress, smudged with dirt and torn at the seams. Her skin was pale, her limbs too thin. Jason glanced at the shelf beside her. Every doll on it had the same dress, same curly hair, same haunting glassy stare. Except one doll was missing its eyes. He swallowed hard. "You're safe now. I'm here to help." Her head finally lifted. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't let him put me back in the box." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's him?" he asked. But she had already curled back into herself, trembling. Jason scanned the crawl space. It extended deeper than he expected. Too narrow for him, but not for someone small. Not for a child or for someone trying to hide them. He pulled out his phone. No signal. "Of course," he muttered. This place was a Faraday cage. Of metal, concrete, and nightmares. "Time to move. Come here," Jason said, reaching into the crawl space. The girl flinched. "It's okay. I won't hurt you. My name's Jason, and this here is Ace. He's a police dog. He found you." Ace took a step closer, head low, ears soft. His tail gave a faint, slow wag. The girl reached out with shaking hands and touched Ace's muzzle. Then, inch by inch, she crawled out. Jason helped her, down to her feet. She could barely stand. "All right," he said, lifting her gently into his arms. "We're getting out of here." Ace backed out of the crawl space and took point, walking just ahead as Jason navigated the warehouse in the dark. Flashlights sweeping over shelves and mannequins that now felt far too human. As they neared the front entrance, the temperature dropped. Jason's breath fogged. It was subtle but noticeable. And then slam. The front door shut on their own. Jason didn't flinch. He shifted the girl in his arms and called out, "If someone's in here, law enforcement is present. Step into the open. This is your only warning." Silence. Ace growled low and threatening. Jason moved to the nearest side exit, tried the handle, locked. Same with the next one. He wasn't just inside a creepy old warehouse. Now he was inside a trap. Jason found a stairwell and carried the girl up to the second floor, looking for another exit, or an office with a window he could break. Ace stayed glued to him the whole way. Ears up, steps light. They reached a break room that had likely been unused for decades. Jason sat the girl down on a musty couch, pulled his jacket off, and wrapped it around her. She stared at him with those hollow, unblinking eyes. "Can you tell me your name now?" he asked. This time she spoke. "I'm Abby." "Okay, Abby. How long have you been here?" She thought about it. "There's no clocks here, no days, just dolls and sleep and lights. Sometimes I wake up in a different place. Sometimes in a box." Jason gritted his teeth. "Did someone bring you here?" She nodded slowly. "He says we're special, says we need to learn to be still." Jason leaned forward. "Who's he?" But her mouth clamped shut. She pressed her palms to her ears. Ace wed softly and nudged Jason's leg. Jason turned to him. "What is it, boy?" Ace moved to the window. Jason followed, and what he saw made his blood run cold. There was a figure outside just beyond the tree end. A man in a dark coat standing perfectly still, staring up at time. The building. Jason raised his flashlight, blinked, and gone. No one there. He scooped Abby back into his arms. We're not waiting for backup. They headed back toward the main floor. Ace's pace was faster now, more alert. Suddenly, he stopped, barked twice. Jason froze. From a door near the old production line, there was movement, not footsteps, dragging. Jason handed Abby a utility knife from his belt. Keep this. Stay behind me. Don't move. He drew a wani sidearm and stepped forward. The door creaked open. A doll rolled out, not walked, rolled on a small platform with wheels. But it wasn't a toy. It was a girl. Jason ran over and realized this one was alive too, bound to a rolling board, arms posed stiffly. Her mouth was taped shut, eyes wild with fear. Jason cut her free. Ace barked again, bolting toward another stack of crates. Jason turned and spotted a trail of what looked like chalk. But it wasn't chalk. It was powder, baby powder. It led to a locked metal cabinet. Jason ripped it open. Inside were two more children, one unconscious, the other crying silently, all dressed as dolls, all wearing the same expression. Fear disguised as innocence. In total, Jason found 4 children that night. And yet, something felt off. The warehouse was too big. Too many hiding places. Too many old compartments and storage rooms still untouched. As sirens finally blared in, the distance, back up at last, Jason looked down at Abby. She was clutching Ace's neck, her face buried in his fur. Jason placed a hand on her back. You're safe now. But even as he said it, she whispered something that chilled him to the bone. He said, you'd come. He said, if anyone found us, it had to be you. Jason stared at her. What? She looked up and smiled. The next morning, Officer Jason Reed stood at the edge of a crumbling front porch in the older part of town, staring at a faded sign that read, Griggs Family Estate. The house had been built sometime in the 1940 seconds and hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The shutters hung, crooked. The lawn was a blanket of weeds. He glanced down at Ace, who was sitting patiently at his side, his eyes being locked on the front door like he was waiting for something or someone to come through it. Jason wasn't just following protocol this time. This was personal. 4 children were pulled out of that nightmare warehouse, and 2 were still unaccounted for. One of the recovered girls had scribbled a name on a napkin while in the ambulance. Melon. It wasn't the first time that name had come up. Malene Griggs was the daughter of the man who had built the doll factory, Lawrence Griggs. She inherited the estate and company when he passed in 2001, but records showed she'd shut down operations within a year. After that, she disappeared from the public eye. No interviews, no news, no local sightings, just gone. Until now, Jason knocked once. Firm, loud. No answer. He knocked again. The curtains inside rustled. I know you're in there, he called. This is Officer Jason Reed with Cascade PD. I'm not here to arrest you. I just want to talk. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. Malene Griggs looked like she hadn't slept in years. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes deeply set behind square glasses. She wore a moth-eaten cardigan over a yellow nightgown, and her hands shook slightly as she opened the door wider. You brought the dog, she said, her voice raspy. Jason nodded. His name's Ace. She stared at Ace for a long time, then stepped aside. I suppose you'd better come in. The house smelled like dust and lavender with undertones of mildew. Jason scanned the space as they walked through the foyer. The walls were covered in family portraits, but none of them recent. Most were black and white. All featured dolls, dozens of them, perched on mantels, curled up in antique cribs, seated at child-sized tea tables. He recognized the same faces from the warehouse, identical, except these were cleaner, unchipped, more lovingly, and displayed. Ace stayed close to Jason, ears twitching as they entered the sitting room. Malene sank into an old armchair. Jason remained standing. I'm going to get right to it, he said. 4 children were rescued from your family's warehouse last night. All of them were dressed like dolls. 2 are still missing. I need to know what you know. Malene said nothing for a while. Her fingers twisted the edge of her sweater. Have you ever lost a child? Officer Reed. Jason blinked. No, I have. She pointed to a dusty photo frame on the end table beside her. Inside was a picture of a little girl, maybe 7, with dark curly hair and big brown eyes. Her name was Elise. Jason glanced at it. I'm sorry for your loss, but that doesn't explain what we found. Malene interrupted, her voice growing hard. Elise disappeared from her room in 998. No forced entry, no ransom, just gone. One moment she was there, the next, nothing. You think that kind of grief just fades? You think I could keep living in that factory, making toys after that? Jason softened slightly. I understand, but someone has been using that building recently. There's evidence of sedation, restraint, and psychological conditioning. You still own the property. We need to know who's been accessing it. Meline's jaw clenched. She stood, walked to a side table, and pulled out a dusty file folder. She handed it to him. Inside, rental contracts, invoices, all signed by a shell company, Joyful Minds LLC. The documents went back nearly 12 years, all authorized access to the warehouse for creative storage. This was the way I could keep the place from getting condemned, she said. They offered to maintain it. I didn't ask questions. Jason pulled one of the pages closer. The contact signature wasn't a name, it was 2 initials. RJ. He looked up. Do you know who RJ is? Meline hesitated. Only by voice. He would call once a month. Ask me how I was. Tell me that Elise would have grown up beautifully. Jason's eyes narrowed. How would he know that? She looked down. Because he said he had her. Jason stepped out onto the porch 20 minutes later, gripping the folder tightly, his mind spinning. The documents gave him enough to push for a full warrant. But it wasn't just the paperwork that rattled him. It was something else, Meline said before he left. He said you'd come. Not a name? Just the one with the dog. Said you'd know what to do when you saw their eye. Jason looked down at Ace. You keeping secrets from me? He muttered. Ace's tail gave a half-hearted wag. Back at the station, Jason spread out the documents. Across his desk, alongside missing persons reports, something caught his attention. 3 of the children rescued. From the warehouse match cases, where the parents had received letters from Joyful Minds LLC promising therapy and recovery programs. One mother had been told her child was accepted into a private treatment facility in the mountains. The kids weren't abducted in the dark. They were groomed away, lured. Jason connected with Detective Sheila Barnes from the Regional Task Force. She'd worked a similar case 5 years ago in Oregon. 2 children found in a shuttered puppet theater. Same symptoms, same conditioning, same silence. There was a pattern. Whoever RJ was, he wasn't just abducting children. He was manufacturing something out of them. And Jason had a sick feeling that Elise, Meline's daughter, had been the first. Later that night, Jason couldn't sleep. He took Ace for a walk through the neighborhood. The wind was heavy with autumn. Dry leaves scraped along the sidewalk like whispers. As they passed a vacant lot near the old train station, Ace stopped, ears up, body still. Jason followed his gaze. There, in the center of the lot, was a single doll sitting upright in the dirt. It hadn't been there earlier. Jason approached slowly. The doll's face was cracked but familiar. Its eyes were painted brown. Its dress, white with a yellow sash, was the same one Abby had worn in the warehouse. Jason picked it up. Underneath, in messy black marker, were the letters. R.J. knows. Ace growled. And from the edge of the woods behind, the lot. Jason heard a sound he hadn't expected to hear again. Laughter. Children's laughter. The doll in Jason's hand felt colder than the October air around him. Its cracked porcelain smile mocked him beneath the streetlight. And the words R.J. knows scrolled beneath its dress buzzed in his mind like static. Ace remained tense beside him, staring at the woods where that faint, haunting laughter had just echoed. Jason scanned. The treeing. Nothing moved, no leaves rustling, no children, just the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears. He stuffed the doll into a paper evidence bag, zipped it shut, and turned back toward the cruiser. Come on, Ace, we're not chasing shadows tonight. But he knew he wasn't dealing with shadows anymore. By morning, Jason had already reviewed the security footage from every traffic camera near the vacant lot. Nothing. The doll had appeared without anyone being obscene, dropped in the middle of the night like a message from someone watching closely. Back at the precinct, the forensic techs had finished sweeping the warehouse. The crawl space led to a maze of old ventilation shafts, most of which had been sealed except for one. One narrow shaft had been pried open, leading to a second sub-bone even knew existed. Jason went there himself. He needed to see it. The moment he stepped into the factory again, something felt different. It was too quiet. No birds outside, no creaking, no distant traffic. Ace led the way, nose to the ground, tail still. He wasn't sniffing randomly. He was tracking. Jason trusted that. They moved past the production floor and through a rusted steel door the forensic team had forced open hours before. Beyond it lay a short hallway with flickering motion lights overhead. At the end was a reinforced freezer-style vault door. Jason approached and ran his hand along its frame. There were no manufacturer markings, no handle, just a fingerprint scanner. He sighed. "You've got to be kidding me." But before he could think of another way in, Ace wed loud repeatedly. Jason turned. Ace was pawing at a low vent near the floor, yanking at the cover with his teeth. Jason got down, yanked it open, and peered inside. There it was, the hidden crawl space again. Only this one didn't lead to a dusty chamber full of dolls. It led to a staircase, one made of iron, and bolted into the ground, disappearing into darkness. Jason crawled in first, flashlight clenched in his teeth. Ace followed, paws silent against the metal rungs. They descended at least 2 stories underground before hitting solid concrete. The air down here was cold, still chemical. The flashlight flicked across sterile white walls, a padded floor, cameras in the corners, motionless but functional. Jason pushed open the only door at the bottom and stopped dead in his tracks. The room was enormous. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with what looked like mannequin parts, arms, legs, heads, but mixed in so subtly he almost missed it were real things. Small shoes, child sizz braces, locks of hair tied with ribbons. In the center of the room was a surgical table. Next to it, a row of steel carts with syringes, gas masks, and white plastic gloves. Ace growled and stepped ahead. Jason raised his light and then froze. There, sitting cross-legged in the middle of the floor, was a child, a boy, maybe 9. He was blinking slowly, eyes glazed. He wore a white smock. His hands were placed perfectly on his knees, posture unnaturally straight. He didn't flinch at the light, didn't look up, just stared forward, blank and obedient. Jason knelt beside him. "Hey buddy, can you hear me?" The boy nodded barely. "What's your name?" No response. Jason took out his badge. "You're safe now, I'm here to help," the boy whispered. "Are you gonna put me back into the freezer?" Jason's breath caught. No, you're not going back there." Ace nudged the boy, gently, licking his hand. It was limp, but the boy's fingers twitched slightly. "Do you know where the others are?" Jason asked. Still no response. Then a faint voice from deeper in the room. "She won't talk. Not if she hears you." Jason stood instantly, turning the light toward the voice. There, behind a curtain of hanging doll parts, was another child, a girl, maybe 11. Her eyes were sharp, awake, and filled with fear. Jason approached. "Are you alone?" She shook her head. "There's 12 of us. There were more. Before. But he took them." Jason's blood chilled. "Took them where?" She stepped back into the shadows. "He doesn't let us see. Just says we're being perfected." Jason's radio crackled finally, just barely. "Officer Reed, back up en route. ETA 7 minutes. He spoke fast. "I'm with 2 children at least 10 more. Unaccounted for. I'm in a subble, not marked on the blueprints. Suspect. Multiple subjects held under psychological conditioning, possibly drugged. Bring paramedics, lights, and don't come in alone." The girl pointed to a corner. "He watches through there." Jason turned to see a camera active, blinking red. "Let's get you out of here." But before he could move, the lights cut out again. Not a flicker this time. Full blackout. Ace barked and lunged toward the door as Jason grabbed both children by the arms and pulled them. Tight. Something moved across the floor. Fast. A dragging sound. Metal on concrete. Jason drew his weapons and shouted, "PD, show yourself." No response. Then the voice came over the intercom. Smooth, calm, familiar. "Officer Reed, you're early." Jason scanned the ceiling, flashlight darting across the dome. "Where are they? Where are the other children?" A pause then. "Not here. Not anymore. But you did well. You found the prototypes. You saw what the others couldn't." Jason's knuckles whitened around the grip of his gun. R.J. Laughter. "I've been called worse." Then silence. Jason tried the door locked. From above, the sprinkler system hissed. Not water, gas. Jason screamed, "Masks now," and ripped one from the steel tray, strapping it over the boy's face, then the girl's. He slammed a third over his own. Ace snarled and barked at the vents, trying to herd them all toward the far corner. Jason kicked open a side panel, hoping for an access hatch. Anything. And somehow, miraculously, there was a maintenance tunnel, tight but crawlable. He pushed the kids through first. Ace followed. Then Jason dove in and pulled the hatch closed behind him. 20 minutes later, they emerged in the alley behind the Pennick factory. Paramedics were there. Back up, too. Jason collapsed to his knees on the asphalt as Ace licked the boy's face, who finally began to cry. The girl turned to Jason, holding his hand tightly. "You don't understand," she said. "What don't I understand?" he asked, exhausted. She looked over her shoulder at the burning warehouse. "He doesn't need the building. He builds the buildings." Jason stared at her. "What do you mean?" she answered in a whisper. "He made a new one already, just like the last. It has dolls and boxes and masks." She looked up at Jason, her voice shaking. "And it's waiting for more kids." The fire at the Griggs warehouse burned longer than anyone expected. It wasn't just the old wood beams and rusted support walls. It was what had been hidden deep underground. Layers of synthetic insulation, chemical containers, and what the fire department called non-standard structural additions. By the time the blaze was under control, half the building had collapsed in on itself, and any trace of the secret subla was gone. Officer Jason Reed stood behind the yellow tape, arms crossed over his chest, Ace sitting at his side. The dog's gaze stayed locked on the smoking ruins like it expected something or someone to crawl back out. "I don't like this," said Detective Sheila Barnes, stepping up next to Jason. She had just flown in from Oregon that morning after Jason flagged her about the disturbing connections to her old case. Too convenient. Fire takes out the only real evidence. No. Suspects in custody. And whoever RJ is still out there. Jason nodded, jaw tight, and he knew we were coming. Back at the precinct, Jason cleared a table in the records room and laid out everything he had. Photos of the dolls, victim profiles, the contract folder from Malene Griggs's house, rental agreements from Joyful Minds LLC. They all shared one key detail. Every document listed a different regional contact, a different email, a different phone number, but always signed with the same initials, RJ. Jason sifted through the signatures trying to find a pattern. That's when he noticed something strange on the contract from 2017. The J and RJ curled upward, forming a subtle loop at the bottom. On the 2019 document, the R leaned left, slanted, almost italicized. Jason grabbed a magnifying glass and pulled out the rest of the contracts. He placed them side by side. His gut was right. The handwriting was different. Not just once, but multiple times. Different signatures, same initials, multiple people, he whispered, or one group using a shared name. He flipped through the evidence. Log. His brain moving faster than his hands. Then it clicked. This wasn't just a lone predator. It was a network. Sheila joined him later that afternoon with a manila folder from a federal cold case unit. "I pulled everything we had on child disappearances with behavioral patterns like the ones you're recovered. Kids showed." She said, "You're not going to like this." Jason opened the folder. There were 23 cases flagged across 7 states. Most of the children were between the ages of 6 and 10. All of them had vanished within a 30-mile radius of old commercial warehouses, closed schools, or defunct factories. Every site had ties to some version of Joyful Minds LLC, Safe Start Foundation, or Littlest Steps Behavioral Group. All fake, all legally registered, all gone within a year of each disappearance. Jason sat back stunned. "RJ isn't a person," he muttered. "It's a playbook, a system." Sheila nodded. "The worst part? I think they're selling something." Jason looked up. "What do you mean?" She dropped a printed PDF on the table. It had been scraped off a private dark web form. On it was an advertisement. "They do not speak, they do not cry. Perfect for static role play environments. Each one crafted with care. RJ Division." Jason stared at the image below the text. It was a photo of a child no older than 8, seated in a tiny wooden chair, hands folded, eyes vacant like a doll. The next day, Jason paid a visit to a contact at the state licensing board, an old friend named Pete who worked in building records and zoning permits. "I need everything you've got on warehouse renovations from the past 5 years," Jason said, "particularly any buildings with sublevels, freezer units, or private ventilation systems. Anything flagged for behavioral services or child therapy, Pete raised a brow. That's a weird combo. Jason handed him a black coffee. So was my week. An hour later, Pete came back with a USB stick. Pulled 28. Addresses statewide, he said. Some were requested under aliases, but a few popped up multiple times under a permit group called, get this, Dollhouse Operations LLC. Jason blinked. That's real. Pete nodded. Registered in Nevada, registered 6 months ago, but they built 2 sites in Cascade County before vanishing. Jason pulled out his notepad. Addresses. Pete handed him a printout. One of them was shut down after a mold report. The other one still standing. Old carpet warehouse just off the highway. Never opened. Lights still on, though. By nightfall, Jason was parked outside the address. The building didn't look like much. Just another long, low structure with faded brown siding and busted signage. No logos, no markings. But as Jason sat in his cruiser binoculars in hand, he noticed something unsettling. A faint glow from the basement windows. Too clean, too deliberate. And then, movement. A silhouette. Not an adult, not a worker, a child. Jason reached into the back seat and clipped Ace's vest on. You ready? Ace barked once. They entered, through the side service door, which had a broken lock. Jason moved carefully, flashlight low, weapon drawn. The upper floor was completely empty, just racks and plastic sheeting. But as they reached the stairwell, Ace stopped cold. Jason heard it too. Music, a lullaby, playing faintly like from an old music box. He crept down the stairs and paused at the final step. In front of him was a plate, glass partition. Behind it, a room lit by soft yellow bulbs lined wall to wall with dolls, and sitting in the middle, frozen like statues, were 5 children. They didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there dressed in satin and velvet, posed. Like toys, Jason whispered. Dear God. He moved fast, calling in units and medical personnel. While Ace sniffed out, a hidden office tucked behind a false wall. Inside the office, maps, files, audio logs. Jason hit play on one tape. A voice began speaking. Cold clinical male. Subject 7 resisted conditioning. Vocal response protocol failed. Initiating silence sequence via auditory suppression mask. Jason slammed the player off, stomach turning. In the corner, a metal cabinet sat open. Inside were 12 masks, fabric-lined, noise, suppressing, equipped with air regulators. Jason stared at them in horror. They weren't masks. They were muzzles. 20 minutes later, paramedics carried the children out one by one. None of them had bruises. None of them looked malnourished, but none of them spoke. Jason approached one of the girls, gently kneeling. She stared at him blankly. He said, "You're safe now." She didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't cry. She just opened her mouth, and inside, taped to the roof of it, was a tiny piece of paper. Jason carefully removed it. It read only 5 this time. You disappoint me. Officer Reed R.J. Jason crumpled it in his fist. Ace growled beside him. Jason stared at the burning lights of the building. This wasn't over. It had just begun. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Officer Jason Reed finally sat down in the quietest corner of the precinct's basement. The building above was humming with movement. Federal, agents, trauma specialists, child protection teams. But down here, it was just him, Ace, in a file folder that felt heavier than its contents. Jason laid the paper from the girl's mouth on the table. Only 5 this time. You disappoint me, Officer Reed. RJ, he stared at the handwriting. Handwriting, trying to match it to any other signature in the mountain of contracts and forged paperwork they'd uncovered over the past 48 hours. Nothing matched. Not the stroke pattern, not the pressure points. Whoever had written this note hadn't signed any of the contracts. He was someone else, someone higher up. Ace let out a soft, low growl, almost like a sigh, and rested his head on Jason's boot. Jason exhaled slowly. What the hell are we even chasing, boy? At sunrise, he returned to the temporary child recovery, a unit set up inside the hospital 2 blocks away. The 5 children rescued from the new dollhouse warehouse had been checked for injuries, starvation, dehydration, and abuse. Medically, things were fine. Emotionally, not even close. None of them had spoken a word since their rescue. All 5 had blank stars. They didn't react to touch, didn't look people in the eye. A psychologist from Portland called it deep-staged, dissociative conditioning. Jason called it cruelty refined. He stopped in front of a small observation room where one of the boys sat facing a wall. His name was Alex, 9 years old. He hadn't moved in hours. Jason entered slowly and pulled up a chair. Ace padded in behind him and sat beside the boy, resting his head on Alex's lap. At first, no response. Then, Alex's fingers twitched. Jason leaned forward. "Can I show you something?" He pulled out the worn photo of Malene Griggs' daughter, Elise, the first known victim. The girl who vanished in 1998. Alex didn't even glance at it. But then, just as Jason stood to leave, Alex said in a barely audible voice, "He took the others, but I kept him." Jason stopped cold. He turned back. "What did you say?" Alex still wasn't looking at him. His gaze remained fixed on the wall. "I kept him." Jason sat back down. Who? Who did you keep?" A beat of silence. Then, the doll maker. Jason had heard the nickname before. Among a few of the forensic teams, it was a half-joke, a short earth hand. They used it to describe the faceless predator behind the warehouse horrors, but this was the first time a child had said it. And it wasn't a nickname to Alex. It was a person, Jason asked gently. "What do you mean you kept him?" Alex blinked once slowly. "In the freezer," he whispered. "He told me to be quiet forever, but I didn't listen." Jason felt every hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Is he still there, Alex?" Alex nodded. "Where?" Alex finally turned his head, looked at Jason. Not vacant, not blank, terrified. "He lives in the cold. He watches the quiet ones, but he can't hear me when I'm still." Jason gently placed a hand on Alex's shoulder. "We're going to stop him, okay?" Alex didn't answer, but for the first time, he cried. Jason left the hospital with a lead. The old refrigeration unit in the warehouse hadn't been checked after the fire. He called Detective Sheila Barnes, who was working with a joint FBI task force now on the case. They met up at the smoldering ruins of the second warehouse before noon. Sheila waved him over. "Jason, you're going to want to see this." They descended into what was left of the basement. Most of it had collapsed, but the refrigeration vault had miraculously survived. Sheila unlocked the door. Stepping aside, Jason entered. At first, it just looked like a storage room, but then his light swept over something in the back, a large freezer chest. He stepped closer, opened it. Inside was a man, dead, late 40s, eyes frozen open, a wide strip of duct tape over his mouth. He was wearing a technician's uniform from the same fake behavioral therapy company, Safe Start Foundation. Jason took a step back. "Is that R?" Sheila asked. Jason shook his head. "Maybe one of them." She handed him a sealed plastic evidence bag. "We found this in his pocket." Jason held it up. It was a small cassette tape labeled Training Tape 001, Vocal Compliance Protocol. Hours later, back at the precinct, they found an old tape deck to play the recording. Jason, Sheila, and two federal agents sat in a quiet room. The tape clicked. A man's voice began. Calm, precise. Phase 1. Initiate silence. Response by triggering auditory overstimulation. Use mechanical noise, static or loud, repetitive sounds to induce discomfort. Remove stimuli only when subject stops crying. Jason stared at the player, fist clenched. Phase 2. Introduce stillness protocol. Use posture correction, weighted arms, or small electric pulses. Positive reinforcement with candy, praise, or sleep. Phase 3. The doll response. Subject must remain quiet, still, and wide-eyed. Any deviation returns them to isolation chamber. Then, as if reading from a training manual, the voice said, "They don't cry anymore. They don't blink. They obey." Jason stopped the release. Tape. No one spoke for a full minute. Finally, one of the agents muttered, "This isn't just a trafficking ring. This is industrialized obedience." Jason stood slowly. "It's mind control." Sheila looked pale. "What kind of human does this to a child?" Jason looked toward the door, the kind who doesn't see them as human. That night, Jason reviewed every missing child report from the past 6 months. He looked for behavioral keywords, patterns, details other people might have missed. He noticed a strange uptick in reports where parents claimed their children had started playing quietly for hours or stared at nothing for long periods right before vanishing, almost like the behavior was pre-installed. He called Pete again at the state licensing board. "I need permit records for any property zoned under play centers, toy design, puppet theaters, or child simulation facilities. Anything that sounds off." Pete groaned. "You're going to owe me more than coffee this time." By morning, Jason had a new address, a recently purchased children's learning facility registered under Calm Play Center LLC. It hadn't opened yet, located in the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood. Jason drove out there with Ace by his side. The front of the building looked innocent. Blue walls, clouds painted on the windows, teddy bears on the sign. But as soon as Jason stepped out of the cruiser, Ace stiffened. Jason followed the dog to the side of the building, where a white van was parked. The license plate had been removed, but the back doors were cracked open. Inside, 2 child-sized mannequins. Jason climbed in and immediately knew something was wrong. The mannequins were too lifelike. Then one of them blinked. The mannequin blinked. Jason instinctively reached for his weapon, but the child flinched and let out a small gasp. She was real. He dropped his hand and leaned in. Hey, it's... Okay, you're safe now. What's your name? No response. The other figure stirred slightly. A boy, maybe 10, pale, shivering, his lips chapped. Both kids were dressed in rigid clothes that mimicked toy store display dolls, velvet collars, synthetic hair extensions, even painted cheeks. Everything about them screamed one word: product. Jason backed out of the van and grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Reed. I've got 2 minors alive in the back of an unmarked white van parked behind 47 Larkview Lane. I need medics and a tactical unit here now. High risk of additional subjects inside the property. Ace barked once, then darted toward the rear of the building. Jason followed. The back door was slightly ajar. A faint melody was playing from inside. An eerie carousel. Tune, soft and mechanical. The same kind of sound that lulled kids to sleep, or, in this case, perhaps conditioned them into stillness. Jason moved slow, gun drawn, flashlight up, Ace heel. The dog returned to his side, tense but ready. Inside the so-called Calm Play Center was empty of children's laughter or furniture. No toys, no crayons, no chairs, just long sterile halls, a receptionist desk, and cameras in every corner. Jason swept the front desk and found a clipboard labeled Unit 3, Shipment Confirmed Pickup. September Trenton Fira, Knoll PM RJ Division Clearance. Approved. He looked at his watch. 3:52 p.m. Jason stormed to the back of the building, following the sound of low, industrial humming. There, at the far end of a hallway, he found a loading dock. A black delivery truck idled at the edge of the lot. Engine running, cargo bay closed. 2 men stood nearby, plain clothes, radio earpieces, one smoking a cigarette like it was just another day at work. Jason raised his badge and shouted, "Cascade PD, don't move." One man dropped his cigarette and bolted for the fence. The other reached under his jacket. Ace launched. The takedown was swift and clean. Ace tackled the man by the thigh, bringing him down with a bark that echoed across the concrete. Jason chased the runner, cutting across the lawn and tackling him just as he reached the service road. The man screamed, tried to fight, but Jason pinned him. Down. "Who are you working for?" Jason growled. The man just grinned. "You think this ends with us?" Jason cuffed him and yanked him to his feet. "No," Jason said. "I think this starts with you." Within the hour, feds had locked down the facility. Inside the delivery truck, they found 10 more children sedated, dressed, imposed like dolls in a custom foam packaging. Some of them had their eyes taped open. Others were breathing through small ventilator holes in plastic mouth covers. It was the most disturbing scene Jason had witnessed in his entire career, but they were alive. Every last one. The investigation exploded from there, with 2 suspects in custody and physical evidence in abundance. The R.J. Division's cover was officially blown. News outlets ran non-stop coverage. Doll trafficking ring. Busted in Cascade. Hero dog discovers child smuggling operation. Officer and K9 saved dozens in underground abuse network. Jason hated the headlines, not because they were wrong, but because they didn't tell the whole story. This wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, more warehouses were raided across the country in Idaho, in Ohio, in rural Pennsylvania. Each one eerily similar. Children hidden in fake therapy centers. Others buried in abandoned toy stores. Yet, the man calling himself RJ was still out there. Jason visited the hospital every day. Most of the rescued kids stayed silent, but Ella, 7 years old, had started to whisper pieces of truth. One afternoon, she turned her wide eyes toward him. "Is the bad man gone?" Jason didn't lie. "I don't know yet, but we're looking. We won't stop." Ella's gaze drifted to Ace, asleep by her bed. Your dog is brave. Jason smiled. Yeah, he's the bravest I know. But then Ella leaned closer. Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. He found me under the toys. I didn't cry 'cause he told me not to. Jason's chest tightened. Who told you not to cry, Ella? She hesitated, then answered. The man, with the puppet voice. Jason froze. She continued, her tiny hands gripping the blanket. He made us say it every morning. I'm just a toy. Before the lights came on. Jason's pen dug hard into his notebook. She wasn't describing a trafficker. She was describing a programmer. Weeks passed. The Griggs doll factory was demolished. The warehouse turned into a memorial garden. But Jason didn't rest. Late one night, in his apartment, surrounded by maps and scattered files, he found it. A note tucked between two contracts. To make a doll, you must first break the child. Founder's Manual, RJ Division, 1996. On the back, a faint watermark. Street Thaddeus Behavioral Institute. Closed 2003. Jason searched. Nothing. Just one archived article from 1994, grainy, black and white. A man smiling, holding a marionette. The caption, Dr. Richard Julian, pioneer in nonverbal therapy for children. Jason's stomach turned to stone. R.J., the real one. The story should have ended. But evil doesn't end. Not like this. For the first time, Jason had names, faces, hope. He looked down at Ace. You ready to keep going? Ace's tail thumped once. Jason stood, slipped the note into his pocket, and reached for his jacket. But just as he opened the door, something made him stop. On the hallway floor, slid under the threshold, lay a doll's head. Its porcelain face cracked, lips painted into a smile, and inside its hollow mouth, a slip of paper. Scrawled in delicate handwriting. I see you, Officer Reed, and I'm not done playing yet. Jason's blood ran cold. The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun.